Welcome to How to Be an Effective Discussant webcast. I am Cindy Winter, NCFR Conference Consultant. This webcast is designed for students and new professionals. However, it is equally helpful for all who are presenting at the conference. The webcast is presented by Megan Haselschwerdt, Ph.D., Assistant Professor, Child and Family Studies, University of Tennessee, Knoxville, who is the past student and new professional program representative. This webcast is designed to give helpful hints for discussants for paper and symposium formats, from planning and preparing to presenting at the conference, to ensure that you have an excellent presentation. Megan will now begin.
All right. Well, I'm going to spend some time talking with you about how to be an effective discussant when you are given that role or you're in that role for NCFR. So my goals for this segment are to define the role and purpose of a discussant, to describe how to prepare for and execute the discussant role, and then I'll conclude with some do's and don'ts for serving as an effective discussant. So a discussant is an individual who is asked by a section chair or a conference program chair to provide additional insight and perspective following the conclusion of the session presenter or presenters. In some cases, you might actually also be in this position because you submitted a paper symposium and you were listed as the discussant. For the most part, the discussant is under the limelight after all of the presenters have been introduced and presented, and at that time you would begin your remarks. The general goal of the discussant is to synthesize the presented papers, which may include a very brief, and I reiterate, brief summary. To synthesize meaning, I mean making connections between the papers, detailing how they connect and converge, but also how they may be distinct or even in contradiction in some cases. Ultimately, the job of the discussant is to take what was previously presented and elevate the discussion for the audience, giving them new insights or perspectives or ways to think about the papers as a collective as opposed to just the individual studies. In many ways, the role of the discussant is a more time-intensive role than the other roles of maybe just even being a presenter because of the advanced preparation that's required. I'll discuss that a bit more in the next slide. It's also important to remember, as I'm sure you can all relate, it's also a very important role because I'm sure you can all relate to being an audience member in a session and seeing how a discussant can really either strengthen or elevate a session, but also how the ways in which a discussant can weaken a session or even frustrate audience members by taking up too much time or not allowing enough room for question and answer at the end. For these reasons, section chairs typically, when they are identifying discussants, they tend to pick those who have a bit more advanced research and professional experiences to help them in that particular role. So as I said, the role of the discussant must begin well in advance of the actual conference. In fact, NCFR requests that all presenting authors send their presentation materials and papers, if relevant, to the discussant 1 month in advance of the conference. The purpose of this advanced deadline is to give the discussant adequate time to read over the materials and craft your remarks. So here's a brief list of what a discussant must do prior to the conference, and I'll give you some examples to help solidify this a little bit further. First, you have to read all the submitted materials. So if the presentations are not in your main area of expertise, it is likely that you'll need to review the materials multiple times to assure that you have a solid grasp on what will be presented. Or it might be that the papers didn't come in really polished form, so you have to spend some more time trying to better understand what the presenters will be talking about. This might be even more so the case if some or all of the presenters are using theoretical approaches or research methods that you are less familiar with. In these cases, you might need to actually do some extra reading to help you understand and strengthen your remarks. The second task that you have after you've read all the materials, and sometimes I begin doing this while I'm reading the materials, is to begin making connections. So typically after you have a solid grasp on the papers in the session that you will be serving as a discussant for, you will then need to start mapping out connections between the papers. In some sessions, the group of papers will be cohesive enough that making these connections is rather simple. So for example, if you worked with a team of presenters to pull together a paper symposium, it's likely that you have a little bit more of an understanding, so making these connections might not be as difficult. But in other instances, the papers may be loosely related, so you'll have to then expand the scope of your analysis a bit more. So for example, you might be a discussant of a session using my area of research that encompasses family violence, but within the section you have a presentation on a longitudinal study on child abuse, a qualitative study on adult women's help-seeking experiences, and a mixed method study on the relationships between exposure to family violence and later romantic relationships. So in that case, there's a connection of family violence, but these papers are actually quite distinct. If you're struggling to make connections between the papers, it might be a good idea to step back a bit and start outlining each paper's strengths, weaknesses, and major contributions. The major contributions may be in the findings, but they also might be in bridging important bodies of literature or applying novel research methods or theoretical frameworks. In other words, this outline might be a useful help step if you're having trouble making these connections, but especially if you're a more novice discussant or have a series of papers that are not overtly connected. So there's many ways that you can tackle coming up with your discussion remarks for your role as a discussant, but one recommendation that I have is to identify 1 to 3 main themes that you think kind of carry across throughout these papers that you can emphasize and build upon. So returning to the example I gave a second ago about the family violence session, when you're preparing your remarks, you might have to think a little bit broader and think, how are the presenters using the same or a similar theoretical approach? Is there a methodological connection between these papers? These questions are broader than the actual topic and findings, which in this particular case would be more important to do if the topics are a bit more disparate or not completely connected. You might get clues about how to do this depending on the section that the papers were submitted to. So for example, if these family violence papers were submitted to research and theory, then it's likely that their overlapping connections might be in regards to theory and methods. So it might be, for example, that all 3 papers are using innovative approaches to answer important questions that have yet to be fully answered. So your focus and your remarks could remain on the methods. Or maybe the section is submitted to feminism and family studies, so the themes could be centered on the application of feminist theories and the diversity within these theoretical frameworks. One thing to note is that if you have a session with 4 papers, it might not be that all of these themes are really applied or relevant to each of the papers. For example, maybe you're only talking about 2 when you're talking about longitudinal analyses, or 3 when you're covering another theme. But it's important to make sure that you acknowledge the work of all of the papers being presented, even if you do tend to talk more about 1 or 2 of the papers, but you want to have a good representation of all that was just presented in your remarks. But ultimately, in the end, your themes or key points should highlight issues for elaboration, discussion, and potentially the implications for research practice and policy moving forward. So once you have your remarks mapped out in a pretty solid direction, you have to then decide how you're going to go about your presentation. So traditionally, or maybe historically, it seemed as though the discussant had their remarks written down in front of them on paper or index cards, and the individual just spoke more off cuff from those notes. But more recently, I've seen a mix, with some people using that more traditional approach and others using a PowerPoint or a Prezi or some sort of visual aid of that nature. The downside to using a PowerPoint when the time is already tight in the session is that if you're not adequately prepared or you don't have your discussion slides ready to go, it might end up wasting more time as you transition into your remarks, and that takes away from question and answer in the end. An additional downside is that you might want to make some slight revisions to your remarks while you're listening to the presenters, and having pre-prepared slides might prevent that or limit your ability to kind of move off of what was just said that you hadn't quite thought about yet. However, one strength to using a visual aid is that it's more friendly to those in the audience with hearing impairments and others who are more visually, prefer more visual aids in general. But whatever your approach is, I think it's important that you're just not reading from your slides, just like we wouldn't in the classroom. But maybe having one slide that simply states your themes or key points might be a good idea, and also will keep you focused on task. So once you're actually in the spotlight and delivering your discussant marks, it's important to note that you have 5 minutes of allocated time according to NCFR, and it's really important that you stay within that 5-minute period. So in many ways, this should be on the previous slide, because you're having to really practice up in advance many, many times to make sure you're not just winging it and going off of your notes, especially if you're not going to have a visual aid, or if this is something that's newer to you, or you're a newer scholar and you're less familiar with how verbose or how quick you talk or how much you're likely to go off on a tangent and that kind of thing when you are not using a PowerPoint. Using just notes is a little bit different. It's important to note that at this moment the spotlight is on you, but the session is really about the presenters, and you are concluding the session and elevating some of the discussion, but you don't want to take more than your allotted time and eat into the question and answer session. When thinking about your actual delivery, so it's important to try to speak slowly, audibly, and importantly into the microphone. Sometimes people will make decisions to stay seated in place or stand right where they're seated, and they might move away from the microphone. So I think it's oftentimes better to go ahead and go to the podium so that you make sure people can see you, especially if it's a more crowded room, but also because you have the microphone there to make sure that you're heard. But it is personal preference, and so if you choose to sit or stand in your place, whichever you decide, make sure you're thinking about your audience and make sure that people can hear, and oftentimes it'd be ideal if people could see you as well. It's important to note that your goal, as I've mentioned, is to synthesize what the presenters have said, so you don't want to summarize. So we can think of this as similar to when we're teaching students how to write literature reviews. Though there's a time and a place for some occasional summarizing of a previous study, we typically want to be focused on synthesizing. So it might be appropriate to provide just a brief summary sentence or two for each paper, especially if there's been 4 papers presented and the audience might forget what maybe the first or second presenters were discussing. But the emphasis is on brief. If you have 5 minutes, you certainly don't want to take more than 1 minute at the very most, and that's probably too much spent on summarizing, because it really takes away from your opportunity to synthesize the research and move the discussion further. One thing to think about is that if you plan to spend a substantial amount of time, or really any time, acknowledging papers' weaknesses or limitations or theoretical approaches or methodological approaches' weaknesses, it's a good plan to first discuss and explain some of the strengths, just as you would maybe in doing a peer-reviewed journal article review. Of course, no paper is flawless, and the papers are all going to have some flaws with them, but I like to think that anything that's being presented will also have some merit or strength, so it's important to be mindful of the strengths. And ultimately, it'd be good if you could leave your audience with some take-home suggestions or questions to ponder to keep them thinking about the presentations after it's over. So finally, I have some do's and don'ts, and some we've covered and I won't go into too much depth with, but for doing the role of the discussant. So the importance of making connections between the literature. One thing I haven't really talked about is that the importance of keeping your remarks focused on the presented papers in some capacity. That doesn't mean that you should never bring in your own work into the discussion, because you might actually be the perfect person to do so, like if the session was constructed around your theory or methodological approach, for example. But the goal should still be to stay focused on the presented papers and providing insight and perspective that shows connections between the papers and gives the audience some additional food for thought. Walking a fine line between talking about your work as it pertains to the other people's work or the presenter's work is quite challenging. So if you're concerned that you might end up going off on your kind of soapbox tangent about your work, you might want to stay more focused on the presenters and less so on yourself. The next point, again, just to reiterate, and again, because I don't think it can be touched on enough, is that your goal is to synthesize, not to summarize. People do not want to hear a 5-minute summary of what has just been presented. They want you to move the discussion forward. And then finally, there might be instances in which you've identified major flaws or issues with one or more of the presented papers, or in general. I think we can all recognize that no paper is flawless, and that all of the work is going to have areas for improvement. With that being said, the discussant does need to mindfully walk the line between providing constructive feedback and disparaging the presented papers, which is ultimately a disparagement of the researchers themselves. Many of the presenters at NCFR are students and new professionals who could really benefit from more critical feedback, but would maybe would appreciate more so on a one-on-one approach or through written comments in the paper that were submitted. This, of course, isn't your job as a discussant, but I've had experience as a student and new professional where I really appreciated a discussant taking some time to add some comments or questions to my papers. And I know that if I was in a position where my work was being disparaged or criticized, I'd prefer that one-on-one than while sitting on a panel. With that being said, firm and constructive criticism is certainly warranted, particularly when, for example, a presenter uses flawed conceptualizations or methodological approaches to presented findings that may actually do harm to marginalized or vulnerable populations. Those instances are tricky and are beyond the scope of this webinar, but I do encourage discussants to err on the side of humanity and constructive approaches when providing public paper session remarks in these instances. And finally, I encourage you to return to the NCFR website for some examples. If you want to see some videos of previously recorded sessions that have discussant remarks with them, that might be really helpful to see how other people have approached it. But ultimately, with your discussant role, you should have fun, be innovative, and inspire your audience to keep thinking about the session after it ends. Thank you for your time, and good luck.